They called her salt-blooded Sarah long before she earned the name. Some whispered it with fear, some with pity, some with the quiet reverence reserved for spirits, not people. But none of them knew what truly lived behind her eyes. None of them knew what would happen after the 37th day. None of them understood that a woman who has survived pain beyond the limits of flesh does not simply return to her tasks. She returns to collect a debt. In 1846, the Hargrove plantation had a cruelty that was whispered about even by other plantations, an accomplishment by itself. Ezekiel Hargrove, the master, was a man who believed pain was the only true teacher. His overseer, Grattan Pike, was worse. The slaves had nicknames for Pike: the Vulture, Red Knuckle, the Salt Man. But the name that stuck came much later, carved into the wood of a broken door. The one who begged. Sarah had been quiet most of her days, known more for her steady work and careful silence than for any act of defiance. She was not born a fighter, not a legend, not a spirit of vengeance. She was a woman who tried to keep her head down because she had someone to protect her little brother, Caleb, the only blood she had left. Then one night, a mistake that wasn't hers changed everything. And when Ezekiel ordered his overseers to make an example out of her, they obeyed with a cruelty that pushed her past the point of fear, past the point of pain, past the point where humanity ends. They rubbed her open wounds with salt. Not once, not twice, 37 days. What walked out of that smokehouse on the 38th morning was no longer the same woman they had dragged inside. What came out was Sarah reborn in pain and sharpened by rage. And the plantation would soon learn. Salt preserves, but it also reminds. And Sarah never forgot a single face. The night they dragged her to the smokehouse was colder than any winter, Sarah remembered, though the air held the thick heat of midsummer. Pain has its own temperature, its own seasons, its own ways of erasing light. She remembered only fragments: the lantern swinging in Pike's hand, Caleb screaming her name until somebody clamped a hand over his mouth, and the way the dirt kicked up behind her heels as they pulled her across the yard. All because a sack of rice went missing, a sack she hadn't even touched. "It's always the quiet ones," Ezekiel Hargrove had muttered as he ordered her punishment, his voice lazy, almost bored. "Y'all strip her, tie her, make her feel it, and salt her wounds, every day, till she remembers her place." Remember her place. Those words would haunt him later. Inside the smokehouse, the air reeked of old meat, of brine, of rot and sweat and the ghosts of suffering. Wooden beams wrapped with hooks glinted faintly in the lantern light. Sarah tasted fear in her mouth like iron. She tried to keep her breathing quiet. She tried not to tremble, but she trembled. Pike grinned at that. "Don't worry," he whispered. "You gon' tremble plenty more before we're done." They stripped her to the waist and tied her to the post-wrist ropes pulled tight enough to burn her skin. The first lash split her back open. The second tore deeper. She clenched her teeth. By the sixth lash, she could no longer feel the individual cuts. The pain fused into one roaring flame that swallowed her whole. Then came the worst part. Pike dipped his gloved hand into the wooden bucket. He'd prepared a bucket filled with coarse salt, the kind used for curing hams. Sarah saw the crystals glisten in the lamplight. She felt them before she could draw another breath. He pressed the salt into her open cuts with a slow, grinding pressure, working it into every tear of skin, every bleeding line across her back. Sarah screamed. She didn't know she had that kind of scream inside her. It burst out of her like something being born. The other overseers looked away, unable even to watch. Pike didn't. Pike smiled. "That's day one," he said. When they finally left her hanging there in the dark, her skin felt like it was on fire. Salt crawled into her wounds like living things, burning, clinging, refusing to let her forget. Hours passed, she couldn't tell how many. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head slumping forward, her breath coming in broken pieces. Somewhere in the darkness, a tiny voice whispered, "Sarah? Caleb." She opened her eyes, barely. He had slipped through a loose plank, tears streaking down his face, hands shaking as he held a damp cloth he must have stolen from the well. He pressed it against her back, but the moment the water touched her, the salt burned even worse. She gasped, and he yanked the cloth back, horrified. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." She forced her voice through cracked lips. "Don't cry, Caleb. You ain't done nothing wrong. Why they doing this to you?" Sarah swallowed pain like swallowing stones. "Because they can. Because they want to. Because cruelty is a game to them." But she couldn't say any of that. Instead, she whispered, "Go. If they find you here, they'll hurt you too." Caleb hesitated. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached out and touched her fingers just once before slipping back out into the night. Sarah cried after he left, but silently, biting down hard enough to taste blood. This was day 1. She did not yet know she would survive 37, nor that on the 38th day she would rise with a clarity sharper than any blade, nor that the first man she would find in the dark would be Pike, and that he would, at last, learn the true taste of salt. The sun barely pierced the horizon when Sarah woke, her body still trembling from the previous night's torment. Every scar throbbed as if each whip had left a heartbeat behind, pulsing in time with her own. The overseer who had delivered the salt-rubbed lashes had mocked her relentlessly, boasting to the other slaves about how nothing but death would come for her defiance. Yet in Sarah's eyes, a fire glimmered, one that would not be doused by chains, salt, or threats. She sat up slowly, her joints stiff, and inspected the walls of her cabin. Shadows danced across the worn wooden planks, whispering the secrets of every cruel act that had occurred here. The other slaves stirred cautiously, keeping their distance. They knew that Sarah's vengeance was not the stuff of mere threat. It was calculated, deliberate, and terrifyingly real. Outside, the fields gleamed with dew. Her master, the man who had ordered her torture, was already visible atop his horse, inspecting his dominion with a sense of pride. He didn't yet know that Sarah had observed him, memorized every routine, every path he took across the plantation, and every weakness that lay beneath his so-called authority. Sarah's mind raced as she formulated the plan. Years of subjugation had taught her patience. Decades of cruelty had honed her resolve. The salt burns on her back were a map of suffering, but also a blueprint for revenge. She would not act in haste. Her strategy required meticulous attention. Each movement, each step, each carefully observed pattern would culminate in a night where the hunter became the hunted. She pulled her tattered blanket closer and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Each scar on her body told a story, not of defeat, but of survival. They were her armor, her secret weapon. Those who had inflicted them believed they had won. They did not know that Sarah carried each mark like a silent vow, an unspoken oath to the spirits of the enslaved women and men who had suffered before her, and to herself. By midday, she had gathered the necessary items: a rusted chain from the barn, worn leather gloves, and remnants of cloth from her tattered garments. To the untrained eye, these were nothing, but to Sarah, they were tools of liberation, instruments of calculated terror. She studied the placement of the whipping posts, the paths the overseers favored, and the timing of her master's afternoon rounds. Every detail mattered. Every misstep could cost her freedom or her life. She moved through the plantation with deliberate caution, maintaining the appearance of submission while her mind was elsewhere, in the shadows, plotting the downfall of the man who had reduced her to a bleeding body and tormented soul. Even the other slaves, who had endured less visible scars, felt the aura around her. Whispers passed among them. She was not just a woman, they said. She was a force, a storm contained within human form, ready to erupt. As night approached, Sarah prepared herself for the first steps of her plan. She hid in plain sight, her scars disguised beneath layers of fabric, and observed her master as he settled near the main house. His arrogance was his weakness, his assumption of control, his undoing. Sarah's patience had been long, but it was a patience sharpened by pain and guided by cunning. The rusted chain she held in her hand was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a promise that the plantation would never again claim her body without consequence. The air thickened with tension as dusk fell. The other slaves had retired to their quarters, unaware that tonight would mark the beginning of a reckoning. Sarah's eyes burned with a quiet fury, the culmination of 37 days of torment and 73 scars. She whispered under her breath, a vow as old as her suffering. Tonight, the hunter would be hunted. And as the moon rose high, casting silver light across the fields, Sarah moved into position, unseen and unstoppable. The plantation had no idea that the woman they had scarred beyond measure was about to rewrite every rule, exacting a vengeance that would echo through the cane fields, the cabins, and the very walls that had once held her captive. This was no longer survival. This was justice, calculated, deliberate, and merciless. The night descended like a velvet shroud, thick and suffocating, swallowing the last hints of sunlight and leaving the plantation bathed in shadow. Sarah moved with the quiet precision of a predator, her steps muffled against the earth as though the soil itself recognized her purpose. Every nerve in her body was alert, every scar on her back a reminder of the torment she endured, fueling her focus rather than slowing her. The main house loomed ahead, windows dark except for the faint glimmer of lantern light where her master and his favored overseers sat drinking, oblivious to the danger coiled in the darkness outside. Sarah paused behind a cluster of magnolia trees, letting the moonlight trace the contours of her determined face. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, the raucous laughter that spoke of arrogance and false security. Tonight, that laughter would die. Her first target was the overseer closest to the house. His cruelty had been relentless, his pleasure in punishing the enslaved unmistakable. Sarah approached silently, her rusted chain coiled like a serpent in her hands. When she reached the back door of the overseer's cabin, she paused, listening. Footsteps within, soft and careless. The man had no idea that the one he had tormented most was at his very threshold. With a swift, practiced motion, Sarah swung the chain, catching the man off guard. The iron links wrapped around his arms, lifting him off his feet before he could shout, and with a strength born from months of suppressed rage, she dragged him into the shadows. The chain bit into his flesh, a mirror of the pain he had once inflicted on her. He screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound, sharp against the quiet night, but Sarah remained calm, controlled, every motion deliberate, every second measured. By the time the other overseers noticed the absence of their companion, Sarah was already moving, invisible in the dark, leaving only the echoes of muffled cries behind. She targeted them one by one, using the terrain, the trees, and the tall cane as cover. Her rusted chain became a tool of terror, swinging with precision, disarming and disabling before they could comprehend the threat. Panic spread quickly among them, their confidence dissolving into confusion and fear. Her master, hearing the commotion, stumbled out onto the veranda, lantern in hand. His eyes widened as he saw the chaos unfolding, the overseers writhing, chained, screaming, utterly powerless against the woman they had all believed broken. Sarah's figure emerged from the shadows, each scar on her body reflecting the pale moonlight, a testament to her endurance and fury. "You thought you could break me," she said, voice steady, carrying across the yard. "You thought 73 scars, 37 days of salt, could silence me. You were wrong." The master raised the lantern, trying to identify the figure in the darkness. Recognition sparked, but horror overtook him instantly. This was the same woman he had believed defenseless, the same woman he had ordered beaten beyond measure. Yet here she stood, commanding, lethal, and unflinching. Sarah moved closer, her chain slithering across the ground like a living thing. Each step she took caused the overseers to flinch. Each breath she drew a countdown to their reckoning. They had underestimated her for decades, believing that their cruelty was absolute. They had never considered the mind of a woman sharpened by suffering, a body honed by pain, and a spirit driven by vengeance. In minutes, the yard had transformed from a place of assumed dominance to a scene of utter horror for the master and his men. Shadows twisted around the chain, around Sarah, creating the illusion of a figure larger than life, unstoppable, almost spectral. The men attempted to flee, but the layout of the plantation so familiar to Sarah was now her advantage. She knew every fence, every outbuilding, every hidden path that could trap them, and she used it to devastating effect. By the time she paused, surveying the yard, every overseer was either incapacitated, chained, or writhing in fear. Her master, standing frozen with the lantern trembling in his hand, realized that the night's terror was far from over. Sarah's scars, her pain, her fury, they were only the beginning. And as she stepped closer, the moonlight illuminating her determined face, she whispered the promise that had carried her through years of suffering. This ends tonight. For the salt, for the lashes, for every man who thought they could break me, I am the reckoning. The yard fell silent except for the labored breathing of the master and the faint, echoing moans of the broken overseers. The night had shifted irreversibly. The woman they had once brutalized now held the power, and every shadow on the plantation seemed to bend toward her, awaiting the final hour of judgment. Her vengeance was only beginning, and the night was far from over. The first gray streaks of dawn had begun to soften the edges of the night, but Sarah moved as if the darkness still clung to her. The yard of the plantation, once a symbol of her subjugation, was now a maze of overturned lanterns, broken fences, and the groans of incapacitated overseers. Each figure sprawled across the ground was a testament to years of silent endurance, every gasp and whimper a marker of retribution long overdue. Sarah paused near the old oak at the center of the yard, the twisted chain coiled around her wrist, dripping faint traces of blood from the small cuts it had inflicted during the struggle. She surveyed the scene, every motion calculated. The overseer's cries had diminished, replaced now by a tense silence, broken only by the faint rustle of the morning wind through the magnolia leaves. The master had retreated to the veranda, the lantern still trembling in his hand, his face ashen and pale. For decades, he had ruled through fear, believing that the lash and the whip could bend Sarah to his will. Every scar she bore, every hour spent enduring salt rubbed into her wounds, had been recorded in her memory. And now, each moment of that memory fueled her movements, her precision, her resolve. She would not let him escape the reckoning he had delayed for so long. With quiet steps, she approached the veranda, the chain dragging softly against the ground. The master's eyes followed her every move, darting nervously to the shadows where his men had fallen. Sweat coated his brow despite the cool morning air, and the lantern's weak light seemed unable to mask the tremor in his hands. He thought perhaps a door or a fence could save him, but Sarah's knowledge of the land, every back door, every hidden stair, every weak railing, was now a weapon in her favor. "You've kept me alive," she said, her voice low but unwavering, echoing across the yard. "You've kept me alive to punish me, to humiliate me, to see how much one body can endure. But I am more than the scars you inflicted. I am the blood, the fury, and the vengeance you could never break." The master swallowed hard, trying to force words past the lump in his throat. "Sarah, I meant—" She cut him off with a flick of her wrist, the chain snapping taut and whipping through the air with a metallic hiss. "You meant nothing. Your apologies are worthless. Your fear is the only thing that matters now." She moved closer, each step deliberate, letting the weight of her presence settle around him like a storm. The overseers on the ground tried to rise, groaning in pain, but the chain was long enough to reach them, dragging them back into submission if they dared to move. Sarah had become both the storm and the executioner. Her mind recalled every lash, every jeer, every whispered threat that had followed her through the long years. But now, she turned that pain into action, precise and unrelenting. The master, once towering in her memory, now seemed small, vulnerable, and terrified in comparison to the power she had amassed in silence. "Do you remember the chain?" she whispered, gripping it tightly. "Do you remember the salt? The 73 scars? Tonight, it is your turn." A tremor ran through the master, but Sarah did not pause. She swung the chain with deliberate force, the iron links catching the corner of the veranda, pulling the railing with a shudder and cracking wood beneath. Each motion was a reminder. The power dynamics of the plantation had shifted irreversibly. She circled him, letting him see her scars in the pale dawn light, each one a story of survival, endurance, and now, impending justice. The overseers watched from the ground, powerless, each knowing their own punishment had only begun, and none could intervene without drawing Sarah's wrath. The chain hissed again as she moved closer, her footfalls silent but filled with purpose, She reached out, touching the master lightly on the shoulder. The touch was almost gentle, but the weight of years behind it made it impossible for him to stand his ground. His knees buckled, and he sank to the wooden floor of the veranda, the lantern tilting and spilling its weak light onto the warped boards. "You have lived on the fear of others for too long," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the plantation like the echo of a drum. "And now, you will understand what it means to live with mine." She drew back the chain, coiled like a serpent, and let it fall across the floorboards. The clatter was deafening in the quiet morning. The master looked at it, eyes wide with horror, as he realized that escape was impossible, that every step he had taken to assert dominance had led him here, to the mercy of the one he had tormented most. Sarah's gaze swept over the plantation, the dawn light slowly revealing the extent of her careful planning. Broken fences, fallen lanterns, groaning overseers all bore witness to the meticulous justice she had enacted. And yet, the master remained, the focal point of her wrath, the embodiment of the cruelty that had scarred her body and her soul. She knelt in front of him, the chain resting lightly on her shoulder, and whispered, "This ends today, but the memory of what you did will linger for the rest of your life. Let it remind you that power is fleeting, and vengeance is inevitable." The master shivered, helpless beneath her commanding presence, as Sarah rose and stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. The dawn was no longer soft. It had sharpened into the clear light of reckoning. The plantation, once a place of unyielding fear, had transformed under her hands into a landscape of justice long denied. In the quiet aftermath, only the wind moved through the magnolia leaves, carrying the echoes of a woman who had endured more than anyone could imagine and who had finally turned her scars into instruments of absolute judgment. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and Sarah's resolve was unbreakable. The master would pay, and every shadow, every creak, every memory of cruelty would witness his reckoning. The sun had barely begun to stretch its first fingers across the horizon, yet the plantation yard was alive with a tension that made the morning chill seem insignificant. Sarah moved through the scattered debris, the echoes of broken lanterns and splintered wood still whispering through the air. The overseers, groaning and clutching their injuries, were no longer the dominant figures they once believed themselves to be. Each step they took toward recovery was met with her sharp gaze, ensuring no further defiance could arise. Her body, though scarred and battered from years of relentless punishment, moved with a predator's precision. Every muscle remembered the pain she had endured, every scar a story of survival and vengeance. Today, the plantation would witness a reckoning unlike any it had ever known. The master remained on the veranda, a figure shrunken and trembling beneath the weight of fear. His face, pale and lined with sweat, reflected a man who had long relied on others' terror to maintain his control. But Sarah had become the embodiment of a terror far greater than any whip or lash could conjure. She had endured salt in her wounds, laughter at her suffering, the relentless cruelty of decades, and now, all of that pain had coalesced into a single, unstoppable force. With deliberate steps, she approached him, the rusted chain still coiled in her hands, a tangible link between past torment and imminent justice. Each link seemed to hum with the memory of what had been done to her, and as she drew closer, the master's trembling intensified. "You have spent your life measuring men by their fear," Sarah said, her voice low and steady, echoing through the empty yard. "But fear can be wielded. It can be turned against those who believe themselves untouchable. You will understand this, finally, in full." The master opened his mouth to speak, stammering something about mercy, repentance, and God, but Sarah cut him off. "Mercy is not for those who find joy in another's suffering," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Your words are meaningless. Only your actions matter now." The chain slid through her hands like water, and with a flick of her wrist, it struck the veranda railing, cracking the wood beneath. The sound reverberated across the yard, a warning to anyone who might consider intervening. The overseers lay still, subdued by the demonstration of power, their own scars a mirror to the master's fate if he dared resist. Sarah's mind replayed every lash, every cruel command, every instance of humiliation inflicted upon her. Each memory sharpened her resolve. She stepped closer, allowing the master to see her 73 scars glinting in the first light, a testament to endurance, to the cost of his cruelty. He flinched, realizing that every scar was a chapter of a story he had written with his own hands, and now it was turning against him. "You've underestimated me," she whispered, her voice slicing through the morning air. "You believed pain could control me, that suffering could break me. But every scar has been a lesson, every wound a tool. And now, I am ready to teach you the final lesson." The master's knees buckled slightly as he attempted to retreat, but Sarah's presence, commanding and unrelenting, left him no space to escape. She let the chain fall with a clang to the floorboards, its echo resonating like the toll of a bell marking the end of his tyranny. Around them, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind had stilled, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves as though nature itself was watching, waiting for the final act. Sarah's gaze swept over the overseers, each man now powerless, each man a witness to the reckoning she had meticulously orchestrated. She circled the veranda, her movements precise, calculating. The master's eyes followed her, wide with terror, as he began to understand that every moment of power he had ever wielded had culminated in this morning. No doors, no fences, no loyal men could save him. Sarah had turned the tools of his oppression, the chains, the punishments, the fear into instruments of justice. "You've lived on the fear of others for too long," she said, drawing closer, the chain coiled tightly in her hands. "And now, you will live on the fear of me." With that, she struck the chain, letting the weight of years of suffering and silent fury guide her strike. The master fell back against the railing, his breath catching, eyes wide with a terror he could not contain. The overseers shivered, powerless to intervene, each aware that the plantation's hierarchy had shifted irrevocably. Sarah stood over him, her figure a blend of fury and triumph. Every scar told a story of endurance. Every step taken to reach this moment had been deliberate, calculated, precise. The master, once a symbol of unchallenged dominance, was now nothing more than a man faced with the consequences of his cruelty. The morning had become her dominion, and as she looked across the yard, at the remnants of fear scattered like debris, Sarah knew that the plantation would never again be a place of oppression without consequence. The master had lived in terror for years, and now he would finally understand the true meaning of fear, one born not of chains or whips, but of a woman whose scars had become the instruments of justice long overdue. The sun had barely breached the horizon, its pale light spilling across the plantation yard, yet the air was thick with the residue of the night's chaos. Sarah moved silently, her bare feet brushing against the dew-soaked earth, each step measured, deliberate. The broken remnants of the whips, the splintered posts, and the scattered tools of cruelty littered the ground, silent witnesses to the storm she had unleashed. Her 73 scars, a testament to decades of suffering, glinted in the early light, reminding anyone who dared look of the horrors she had endured and the power she now commanded. She paused by the overturned whipping post, running her hand over the jagged edges where iron had bitten into wood, and felt a shiver of satisfaction. Every mark, every crack, every splinter told a story of endurance, of survival, and now, of vengeance. The overseers, once proud and unyielding, crouched in the shadow of the barn, nursing their injuries. They avoided her gaze, knowing that any misstep, any hint of defiance, could ignite her wrath again. Sarah's presence was magnetic and terrifying at once. She had become more than a woman scorned, she was an embodiment of retribution itself. She moved toward the master, who had barricaded himself in the main house. The door shook under the force of her gaze, and he cowered behind it, realizing that the years of inflicting pain upon others had led him to this inevitable reckoning. His voice trembled as he called out, "Sarah, I beg you, mercy." Sarah laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor and filled with the chill of inevitability. "Mercy is not for those who take joy in another's suffering," she said, her voice carrying over the yard. "You've spent years teaching fear. Now, you will learn it." The master's knees buckled as he stumbled backward, but there was no escape. Sarah's mind replayed every lash, every order, every moment of humiliation he had inflicted upon her. Each memory sharpened her resolve, her muscles coiled with the tension of a predator ready to strike. She gripped the rusted chain tighter, letting the memory of every wound guide her strength. The wind carried the faint echoes of screams from the overseers, now nothing more than spectators to the judgment that was about to fall. Sarah's steps were relentless as she approached the house, the chain dragging behind her with a metallic whisper, like the prelude to a storm. Every plank of the veranda beneath her feet seemed to tremble in acknowledgement of her power, the very structure of the plantation shivering under the weight of what was to come. She reached the doorway and paused, letting her gaze sweep over the master. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, realizing too late that the pain he had inflicted for decades had been merely a rehearsal for the retribution awaiting him. "Do you feel it now?" she whispered, her voice low, venomous. "Do you understand the weight of your sins?" The master stammered, attempting to offer excuses, prayers, anything to divert the inevitable. But Sarah would not be swayed. She coiled the chain once more, letting it thrum in her hands, a tangible manifestation of all the suffering, all the rage, all the years of torment he had caused. Without hesitation, she struck, the chain snapping forward with a force born of pure will and years of pent-up fury. The sound echoed across the plantation, a symphony of judgment and retribution, reverberating through every corner, every scarred post, every trembling overseer. The master's cry split the morning air, a sound of raw, unadulterated terror. Sarah's eyes did not waver. Each motion, precise and controlled, was a message. Cruelty breeds consequences, and those who sow pain will reap a harvest of their own making. She circled him slowly, the chain swinging in deliberate arcs, ensuring that every movement reminded him of the power he had so long underestimated. Around them, the plantation lay silent, save for the faint groans of the injured and the distant rustle of leaves. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath, witnessing a reckoning that had been decades in the making. Sarah's figure, a study in resilience and wrath, cast long shadows across the yard, shadows that would remain imprinted in memory long after the sun rose fully into the sky. Finally, she paused, letting the weight of her presence, her scars, and her fury settle over him. "Remember this day," she said, voice firm, unwavering. "Every lash, every wound, every moment of suffering you inflicted, it has brought us here, and from now on, no man will ever use fear as his shield against justice." The master slumped to the ground, broken not just in body but in spirit, and Sarah stepped back, surveying the scene. The overseers cowered, the broken tools lay scattered, and the yard bore the evidence of her triumph. She had endured, she had survived, and she had finally claimed her reckoning. Sarah's eyes, filled with fire and sorrow, scanned the horizon. The plantation would never forget this day, the day that the slave with 73 scars became the master of her own destiny, the arbiter of justice, and the embodiment of vengeance long overdue. The morning mist hung low over the plantation, thick as sorrow, clinging to the broken posts and splintered wood of the yard. Sarah moved through it like a shadow, each step deliberate, each scar on her body a map of the suffering she had endured and the fury she carried now. The events of the previous night had left the plantation in disarray. The overseers whispered among themselves, their bravado extinguished, their injuries a silent warning. Her eyes settled on the master's house. The heavy oak doors had been reinforced since the morning, but Sarah did not hesitate. She was the storm incarnate, the embodiment of decades of cruelty transformed into a singular, unstoppable force. Every fiber of her body screamed with purpose as she approached, the rusted chain coiled in her hands, ready to serve as an instrument of justice. The master himself peered nervously from a shuttered window, his face pale, lips trembling. He had spent a lifetime inflicting pain, and now he felt the weight of every lash he had given, every command he had barked, every moment of humiliation he had forced upon others. He was powerless, and he knew it. Sarah paused at the threshold, letting her gaze sweep over the yard. The overseers knelt on the ground, nursing bruises and cuts, their fear palpable. They had been complicit in the atrocities, Yet now they were nothing more than witnesses to the reckoning she had orchestrated. "You will see," she whispered under her breath. "Justice is patient, but it is inexorable." She stepped forward. The door creaked under her touch, the sound echoing like a tolling bell across the yard. Inside, the master tried to muster words, to beg, to plead, but the power in Sarah's presence rendered him mute. Her scars, raw under the morning light, seemed to radiate an authority that transcended flesh and bone. He could see in her eyes the memory of every strike, every humiliation, every stolen moment of her freedom. The first strike of the chain was precise, a calculated reminder of the pain he had inflicted. It cut the air with a metallic hiss, and the master flinched instinctively, a sound of pure terror escaping his lips. Sarah moved with unrelenting force, circling him, each swing of the chain deliberate, each lash a lesson in consequence. The master's cries filled the house, mingling with the groans of the overseers outside, a cacophony of dread and realization. Hours passed, though the sun barely rose above the horizon. Sarah did not tire. Her body moved with a rhythm born of rage and resolve. Each strike of the chain carried the weight of history, a reminder that cruelty and oppression always sow the seeds of retribution. The overseers, once confident in their authority, were now silent, their gazes fixed on the woman who had become the embodiment of vengeance. Finally, Sarah paused, the chain coiled around her arm like a living thing. The master cowered before her, his body trembling, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of his mortality and his failures. "Remember this day," she said, her voice low and unwavering, "for it is the day that cruelty found its reckoning." She let the chain fall to the floor with a metallic thud, its echo a reminder of power reclaimed. The overseers had learned their lesson. The master had learned his. The plantation, scarred and battered as it was, would never forget the force that had risen from the ashes of oppression. Sarah, the slave of 73 scars, stood triumphant, the embodiment of vengeance, resilience, and the terrifying weight of justice finally served. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the broken yard, the shattered doors, and the fear etched into every face. Sarah did not celebrate. There was no joy in vengeance, only the quiet satisfaction of balance restored. She turned away from the house, her gaze sweeping over the plantation, knowing that while the scars would remain, so too would the lesson. Cruelty begets consequences, and no master is invincible in the face of justice. Her path was clear, her resolve unbroken, and though the plantation would whisper her name in fear for generations, Sarah knew she had claimed her rightful place, no longer a victim, but the arbiter of reckoning, the woman who had transformed pain into power and scars into authority. The plantation was quiet now, though the silence carried a weight heavier than any whip. The sun rose in muted tones over the broken fields, highlighting the remnants of a place where fear had once ruled unchallenged. The overseers no longer dared to speak above a whisper. The master, if he remained at all, was a shadow of a man, hollowed out by terror and the memory of what Sarah had done. The chain that had served as an instrument of retribution now rested coiled in the corner of the yard, a mute monument to vengeance carried out with precision and inevitability. Sarah walked among the remnants of the plantation, her scars catching the light like a constellation of battles fought and survived. Each mark on her skin told a story, each strike a chapter of suffering, each healed wound a testament to endurance and survival. And now, every scar also told the story of justice, of a life reclaimed from oppression, of power transformed from pain. She moved with purpose, aware of the fear and respect that her presence inspired. The people who had once cowered under the lash now looked upon her not as a slave, not as a victim, but as a force of nature, inexorable, unyielding, and untouchable. Over the next weeks, the plantation's routines changed, though the landscape of trauma remained. The overseers who survived the reckoning carried the memory of Sarah's strength in every movement, every glance, every hesitant order. No one dared to touch another soul without her permission. Rumors of what had transpired spread through the region. Tales of the slave who bore 73 scars, who turned chains of oppression into instruments of justice, whose hands carved power from suffering itself. Her legend grew, whispered in fear by those who once believed themselves untouchable, revered by those who saw in her the embodiment of courage and the moral certainty that cruelty is always answered. Sarah herself did not linger in fame or fear. She moved through the plantation, reclaiming what had been taken, the fields, the barns, the spaces of labor and oppression. Every corner became her own, every breath a statement of autonomy. The master, if he had survived, was relegated to shadows, a lesson of fragility to any who might have thought to repeat his crimes. And while the scars on her body would never fade, neither would her resolve, nor the sense of justice she had carved into the earth of that place. In the evenings, she would sit beneath the sprawling oak at the center of the plantation, where the morning light had once illuminated fear. Here, she reflected on the arc of her life. The lashes endured, the betrayals suffered, and the power finally reclaimed. The scars were hers, yes, but so too was the victory. She had transformed her pain into a weapon and used it to dismantle the edifice of cruelty that had sought to define her existence. Word of Sarah spread far beyond the plantation's boundaries. Across counties and states, whispers of her deeds reached ears both sympathetic and envious. She became a symbol not merely of vengeance, but of resilience, a testament to the unbreakable spirit that can endure oppression, rise from it, and turn the instruments of suffering into tools of liberation. Parents told their children of her courage, slaves spoke her name with reverence, and even former oppressors carried her story as a warning. The cruelty that is visited upon others will always return, in some form, with consequences unflinching and absolute. Years passed, yet the plantation never returned to its former rhythm. The land itself seemed altered, as if it bore witness to the power that had erupted there, the energy of justice enacted and fear transformed into law. Sarah's legend became inseparable from the place itself. The chains, the scars, the echoes of the master's cries, they all existed as memories embedded in the soil, a perpetual testament to the price of cruelty. And Sarah? She endured. Not in submission, not in secrecy, but in the authority earned through pain and reclaimed power. She became a quiet sentinel, the keeper of justice, the living proof that no system of oppression is impenetrable, no master invincible. Each day she walked among the fields. She reminded the world and herself that the body may be wounded, but the spirit, when forged in pain and tempered by resolve, is unconquerable. By the end of her life, Sarah was a name spoken with awe, a figure etched in memory and legend alike. She had been the slave of 73 scars, the woman who wielded suffering as a weapon, the force that unmade a tyrant and reshaped a plantation. And though time moved forward, fading the flesh and blood of those who had once ruled through terror, her story remained, a testament to endurance, to vengeance, and to the unassailable power of a spirit that refused to be broken. The plantation, scarred and solemn, stood as both grave and monument, and in every whispered story of that place, Sarah lived on not merely as a survivor, but as the embodiment of justice, fear, and the enduring force of a will that could not be chained. Her legacy was not measured in revenge alone. It was measured in the reclamation of life, the assertion of dignity, and the terrifying, undeniable truth that those who would inflict cruelty on others will always, eventually, face the consequences of their own design. And so, in the quiet of the fields, in the sway of the trees, in the echoes of chains and cries long past, Sarah's spirit endured unbroken, untamed, and eternal.